Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of the Listening Room Sonic Journeys. I am your host, your groove guru, and your guide to the vibes, a cultural DJ. And on this episode, we're beginning a brand new segment. It is called Genre Genesis, which delves into the beginnings of various genres of music. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe. I post new episodes every Thursday, except for sometimes, depending on my schedule, it might be Friday. Like this episode is coming out on a Friday, so I try to shoot for every Thursday, but depending on my work schedule and life schedule and everything, it might be on Fridays. So just be sure to look on Thursday. And if not on Thursday, then Friday. With all that said, let's get right into it. This first edition of Genre Genesis is going to be about post-punk. I'm super excited because post-punk is one of my favorite genres of music, and I'm looking forward to delving into these. So the way this is going to go is that I am going to list out 4 records that I believe started post-punk. We're going to go through them each, kind of give rather brief reviews, more or less, but also describe why they were the first or among the first of the genre and how they really kind of kickstarted the culture of that genre. So first we're going to talk about, or if I don't want to assume that people listening know exactly what post-punk is. So post-punk is it's a genre technically, but I tend to think of it more as an aesthetic, really. It's a genre that was a reaction to punk rock that ran concurrently with punk in the late 70s and early 80s. It was a rejection of the rigidness of punk rock. You know, it asked the question, can punk be more than what it was? So it included a lot of avant-garde sensibilities and genre blending. You might have punk bands that were utilizing funk, electronic music, jazz, dub and reggae, disco, even krautrock from Germany. So it combined a lot of different elements of music. Sometimes it might just be punk with something else, and sometimes it might be a whole conglomeration of different genres of music to make this big ol' music spaghetti. So, you know, it depended. It was a case-by-case basis, and that's also important to mention because post-punk didn't really have a defined sound. There are some bands that are kind of notable in the scene where it's like, okay, this is post-punk, like you hear it and it's like, okay, this is definitely post-punk, or this is definitely influenced by post-punk, but at its genesis, post-punk didn't really have one defined sound. It was really dependent on the band and a lot of times the location as well. Along with the different genres, they would also include a lot of elements of modernist art in the lyrics, in a lot of like the literature and film references. It was a lot of the people that were involved in post punk were not film students, but film students. But I meant to say art students. People that were going to art school would include a lot of their tutelage in their music, a lot of their lyrics. So a lot of the lyrics were very poetic or subversive or oblique. Not as straightforward as your typical punk rocker would be. And that definitely helped to set apart what is, I guess, considered regular punk rockers from those who were involved in the post-punk movement. Now, let me quickly go over what post-punk is not, so we don't get confused. Post-punk is not progressive rock, even though there are several shared elements between the two. These are completely distinct movements with very distinctive contexts. Now, progressive rock focused more on technical, instrumental virtuosity and sonic construction. They wanted to make it sound as sleek and as, you know, futuristic and, well, not always futuristic. That's not really the accurate term, but they want to make it sound as innovative. It's a good word to say, as innovative as possible. While post-punk focused way more on texture and experimentation while still maintaining sparse production and a DIY ethos. The DIY ethos that essentially made punk what it was. Also, post-punk, it is very, very important to mention when it comes to genres of music or art movements or anything like that, that despite being referred to as post-punk, That does not mean that it came after punk. I already said that it ran concurrently, but it bears repeating that the post prefix is not temporal, and it implies a reaction. It was a reaction, again, to punk's rigidness. It said, well, okay, we have the punk bass, but I feel that we can do more. There's other styles of music out there. There's way more things we can add to punk to make it cooler, to make it more fresh, to make it more interesting. And that's what post-punk really is at its core. It came at the same time as punk in the late 70s and early 80s. So that is what post-punk is not. It is not progressive rock, and it did not come after punk. So now let's get into the meat and potatoes of this discussion. The first of 4 albums. The first one is one I was a little bit trepidatious about adding because it is technically post-punk, but it also would be equal to say that it's more proto-post-punk, if that makes any sense. The first album is Marquee Moon by Television, which came out in 1977. I've often read that this is regarded as the very first post-punk album, but I know there is a bit of contention with that claim. The reason why I put it is because, why I say it's a proto-post-punk album is because it did a lot of things first as far as building the foundations and the conventions of what would become post-punk. I mean, Television is an American band, and the band itself is among the very first to perform at CBGB. And it's really one of the first punk bands proper. At any given night at CBGB, you would see Television on the same bill as Ramones or the Dead Boys. So, yeah, there's that, and the fact that post-punk is often associated with, British bands, especially early on. But Marquee Moon is a landmark record, not just in post-punk and not just in punk itself, but also rock and roll as a whole, because it showed what was possible for American punk. Because at this point in time, and again, this is why I was a little bit cautious about putting it here, is because it showed what was possible for American punk, but it came so early on that you still had bands like Ramones being super popular and still making really kind of rudimentary punk rock with 3 power chords and just blazing through 3-minute songs. And then you have Marquee Moon with tracks like the title track, which is like 10.5 minutes long, or Torn Curtain, the final track on the album, which is like 6.5 minutes long, and many of the tracks are about 5 minutes long, 5.5 minutes long, as opposed to there being, maybe one guitarist, and they're just blazing through these 3 power chords. You have a lot of guitar interplay between the lead singer and guitarist Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd. And you see that a lot, especially on the title track, Marquee Moon. It's, again, 10 minutes long, or 10 plus minutes long, and you hear a lot of interplay. You hear, the main ostinato part and then some soloing in between. You have these really poetic lyrics from Tom Verlaine, really just kind of hard to get. Not really straightforward love songs or heartbreak songs or, I'm mad about something songs, just really kind of subversive, artistic wordplay. And that's really what makes Marquee Moon stand out amongst its peers early on, because this is 1977. A lot of the ones we're going to be talking about come a few years later, but 1977 is like right near the birth of punk. Between 76 and 77. Marquee Moon was such a groundbreaking and landmark album for punk rock because of all that it did and all that it showed very early on where punk could go and where punk would end up going through these next records we're going to be talking about. Now, our next record is going to be The Scream by Siouxsie and the Banshees, which came out in 1978. This is the debut studio LP by Siouxsie and the Banshees. And if Marquee Moon was an attempt at showing what can be added to punk to make it more interesting, the thing that The Scream added to punk was it showed that punk could inject atmosphere. It maintained the punk attitude, but it strips away the aggression in favor of more artistic, cold, moody atmosphere. That's really kind of the linchpin of The Scream. And you feel that in especially like the first track, or well, the first track proper, Jigsaw Feeling. It has that punk rhythm with the driving guitar, the bass, and the drums, but you have Susie's howling vocals adding like a strong element of eeriness and just really kind of like a haunting feeling. And then you have their cover of the Beatles' Helter Skelter, and it sounds like it's being like performed by undead zombies. It's just really chilling. And you have like Suburban Relapse with those jagged angular guitars that you would definitely find in punk rock, and they pierce like arrows. But then you have like Susie's vocals, which are like, it's almost like she's chanting a curse on you. You know, the focus on texture and atmosphere would actually bode well for them as they went into almost sort of inventing neo psychedelia a few years later with albums like Kaleidoscope and A Kiss in the Dream House. You know, they would inject those swirling, just really kind of heady, really colorful textures to what they were already doing on this album to make those albums and build what would become early variations of neo psychedelia. And of course, you have them inventing goth rock as well with Juju. You know, Susie and the Banshees is often regarded as the first goth rock and cold wave band, so they were extremely innovative in that way, and it's all because of their focus on building this really kind of dark, moody atmosphere and these really blanketed textures, these really dark textures, and that's what the Scream is all about, and that's why the Scream, which, you know, came out only a year after Marquee Moon, would be considered one of the first post-punk albums. And Susan the Banshees, as well as the next band we're going to be talking about, is also one of the only few post-punk bands that were even really majorly successful around 1978. And speaking of that next band, album number 3 of 4 is going to be Metal Box by Public Image Limited, also known as Second Edition. It came out in 1979. Now, if you're at all familiar with Public Image Limited, you may be asking why this second album. This is the second album by Public Image Limited, or PIL, P-I-L. If you're familiar at all with PIL, you may be asking why the second album and not the first one, which is called First Edition. And the reason why I decided to pick the second outing is because I feel personally that the first album tried really hard to prove a difference between Public Image Limited and the Sex Pistols. The leader of Public Image Limited, John Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten, was the leader of the Sex Pistols, who are, you know, among the earlier punk rock bands, right? They were hugely influential in the realm of punk rock, especially British punk, because they're from Britain. But I feel that their first album tried really hard to kind of say, we're not the Sex Pistols, we're completely different, this is not the Sex Pistols, this is what we're about. And then this album, Metal Box, said, okay, we showed you that we're not the Sex Pistols, so now we're going to show you what we can really do as a band. And they doubled down. They not only doubled down on everything that they did on their first album, but they also expanded a lot. They have a variety of styles, and this is kind of the album that shows what post-punk can really be as far as how diverse it can be, because it has strong elements of dub, it has elements of noise rock, of krautrock, of funk, of dance. It's super diverse, but it's also really kind of, it feels messy, but at the same time it's just like a really kind of cyclical thing. Like, there's a lot of cyclical grooves on it. The tracks do tend to kind of run on the lengthy side. Like, the album as a whole is about an hour long, and then you have tracks like Pop Tones, which is one of my favorite tracks, but it's also 8 minutes, and about half of it is just a repeated phrase over and over and over again until the very end. The track Albatross, much like Marquee Moon, is 10.5 minutes long, so the tracks do run for a bit, and that makes it, in a way, kind of a difficult listen if you're not someone that's into songs that run for longer lengths. Anything longer than like 2.5 minutes, 3.5 minutes, whatever. This might not be for you, but I promise you that it is rewarding if you can, kind of sit with it and let it marinate in your eardrums. There's also, like the title of the album implies, Metal Box. It has a lot of metallic timbre to it, and that is much due to Keith Levine, the guitarist's playing style and the effects that are used. It sounds very metallic-y, almost like proto metal in a way. It also, like I said, injects a lot of dub rhythms, and that's much due to the bassist Jah Wobble. And the band itself was very much influenced by the dub movement going on, a la people like King Tubby, like Lee Scratch Perry, like the Upsetters, like the Revolutionaries, all those bands. And you hear that especially on tracks like Pop Tones and Careering. And for me, this album is really a definitive work in post-punk because, again, it really kind of showed just how much you can inject into punk rock to make it this more artistic, this more forward-thinking and innovative thing, which is what post-punk was, in essence. And now we have our final album of 4. That is going to be Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division, which was released in 1979. I will go out on a limb and say that this is probably the most popular post-punk album of all time. It's superly influential, and it's one that often, when people talk about post-punk and, what post-punk sounds like, and despite what I said earlier about post-punk not really having a sound, when it comes to, like, okay, this is definitely post-punk, like, you hear something, it's like, that's definitely post-punk, this is kind of the album that people talk about. This is the one that they refer back to. Like, this album is what post-punk, for a lot of people that listen to it, sounds like. And if the Scream focused predominantly on atmosphere, well, this album cranks atmosphere up to 11. It's almost entirely built on setting a mood of dread and emptiness and gloom, and it sounds like what darkness feels like, essentially. It's a very, I don't want to say depressing album, but it is very dark. And it even aside from the lyrics, it just feels like what darkness looks like, right? And a lot of it often feels, it sounds like it sounds like it's going to constantly fall apart. A lot of the tracks go into like this frantic, just really emotional, anxious breakdown, and it feels like it's just all going to fall apart. And you hear that especially with the very fittingly titled track She's Lost Control, which is a fantastic track, but throughout like the chorus and the bridge and everything, it just sounds like it's about to crumble to pieces. And a lot of the tracks kind of feel like that. It all maintains a very clear punk drive because, Joy Division was around at that time. They were majorly influenced by the bands that were showing up at CBGB, but it's dampened by this uncompromising just void, this swath of reverb and echoes, and you hear that on, like, it's interesting because you have tracks that are fast and up-tempo like Disorder, and then right after you have tracks like Day of the Lords and Candidate, which are very slow and lethargic and just dirgy. It has that juxtaposition between, this kind of feels like punk, but then it's like, just we're going to, slow it down and just let the atmosphere and the emotion and the anxiety just kind of build to this big thing, right? And much like the Scream, this album would heavily inform cold wave and goth rock. That's kind of its legacy, is that it was, along with the Scream and much of that early Susie and the Banshees work, it was kind of like the first, or among the first cold wave albums, among the first goth rock albums, because of its ability to just build a really dark mood and vibe. So those are our 4 albums, but I wanted to also add some honorable mentions as well. These are some albums that came out around the same time that were doing a lot of the same things, but I wanted to stick to 4 main ones. So our first honorable mention is going to be Chairs Missing by the band Wire. This is their second album. Their first album, Pink Flag, is a legendary album, and it's among my favorites, but I feel that Pink Flag sticks a lot to the conventions of traditional punk rock versus Chairs Missing, which tends to tap more into like progressive rock and psychedelic rock, and just be generally more keen on experimentation. The next honorable mention is going to be Cut by the Slits. This is their first album, and it was notable for its inclusion of dub and reggae into the punk sound. The next one is going to be Real Life by Magazine. This is their first album also, and it is considered a seminal work in the realm of post-punk, and also new wave as well, especially the single Shot by Both Sides, which is considered a seminal work in pop punk as well. And then the final one is not an album, but actually a song, and that is Going Through the Motions by the band The Prefects. And the Prefects are considered among the first post-punk bands, but Going Through the Motions is a track that adds a lot of psychedelic, just really repetitive, kind of similar to Metal Box in a way, drone to the mix. And then its B-side, Things in General, is, it has elements of post-punk, but it's more straightforward punk. It's mostly Going Through the Motions that I want to talk about in this one as the honorable mention. So yeah, Chairs Missing by Wire, Cut by the Slits, Real Life by Magazine, and Going Through the Motions by the Prefects are the honorable mentions. As a final piece, I just want to say that post-punk is one of my all-time favorite styles of music. Many of my favorite bands are in this genre. I like Talking Heads, Television, The Cure, Echo and the Bunnymen. I love this genre so much. It's one of my favorites. It's one of my favorites to research, to talk about, to listen to. So this episode was really fun to make. I was super excited to kind of delve into these records and talk about them and talk about why they're so important to this particular genre in how they help to not only create it, but also help to develop it. So with all that being said, I will leave you all off with that. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you all enjoyed. Be sure to check out the socials. The links will be in the description for that. Be sure to check out the articles and essays that I write on Substack. The link for that will be in the description as well. And also, as always, check out the playlist, the accompanying playlist that I make for both YouTube and Spotify with songs that are from each of these albums. They'll be in there to kind of get a better idea, a better context for what these records sound like. That'll be in the description as well. Again, be sure to like and subscribe. And yeah, thank you all so much again for listening, and I will see you all in the next episode. This is the Cultural DJ signing off.